From Synozur, this is Polaris. I'm Chris McNulty. Today, we're looking ahead to the emerging role of fractional executive leaders, CxOs. Why are they becoming more prevalent? What do they mean for business? What's it like to become one? And what's the future of fractional work? This is Polaris. Welcome to Polaris Pathways, and welcome to our first episode of 2025. I'm your host, Chris McNulty, Head of Strategic Markets at Synozur. Synozur is an advisory agency focused on transforming business for our clients, navigating the complexities of transformation and strategic planning with ease. Today, we're looking at fractional leadership, CxOs, in 2025. Our guest, Michelle Caldwell, is the CEO and founder of Synozur. She has a fascinating career across companies like Undivided and across the world. And we'll let her introduce herself in a minute. Let's define our terms. When I say fractional CxO, I'm using X, lowercase, to borrow from high school algebra, as the variable in the C-suite. It could represent a chief executive officer or an operational COO, finance, security, HR, product, marketing, and so forth. On the other hand, some companies have a job title for chief experience officer who oversees employee and customer experiences for their brands. That job is also sometimes abbreviated as CxO. Today, though, we're talking about the full range of fractional executive leaders. Since 2016, the term fractional CxO has experienced an exponential boom. Temporary business management, or fractional jobs, were up 18% from 2021 through 2022, and they're up over 57% since 2020. This surge has been driven by the need for cost-effective solutions and flexible leadership, especially among startups and smaller businesses. The number of people listing fractional CxO roles on LinkedIn has also jumped in the past few years. As of January 2024, there were about 282,000 LinkedIn users who were fractional chief marketing officers, and even more across the broad range of CxOs. This trend represents the growing popularity and acceptance of fractional executive leadership. And also in 2021, over 5 million new businesses were created in the U.S., according to the Census Bureau. We have more organizations needing more leadership all the time. So it's not a surprise that those pressures give rise to new types of role, the fractional CxO. So let's bring today's guest, Michelle Caldwell, onto the Polaris stage. Michelle, welcome back to Polaris. Can you start out by explaining a little bit about your background and a little bit about Synozur to our audience?
Sure, Chris. Thanks for having me back. So I'm currently the CEO of Synozur. I launched that about 2 years ago. Prior to that, I spent about a decade at Avanade Accenture running various different North America-wide practices for them and supporting their customers. And prior to that, I worked at a regional company in Central Ohio. I'm from Ohio, currently living in Seattle area. And I led their SharePoint practice and headed up delivery management for them. And then before that, I was at Nationwide Insurance as a program manager in their business architecture group.
Well, since you're from Ohio, obviously, congratulations to your Buckeyes for their national championship earlier this week.
Thanks. OH.
I-O, so they say. So let's get into it. Can you explain a little bit about what a fractional CxO is and how it's different from traditional executive roles?
So when we talk about that fractional, highly experienced executive or leader, it doesn't have to carry a C in front of it. But if we look at that highly experienced person who probably in their background has worked with multiple organizations in their past, has a very strong track record of success in those different organizations and their history. We're talking about having someone high-powered, highly experienced in a part-time or contractual basis. And I want to be careful when we say part-time because often fractional C, fill-in-the-blank O's are not necessarily employees of that organization. They can be, but are often on a contract basis and potentially even being contracted across many different customers at once to provide strategic leadership and expertise without the long-term commitment of a full-time role. And there's a lot of benefits to having someone who isn't necessarily, let's say, beholden to maybe protecting their role or their stock options or being subservient to some other cultural things that could potentially hold an organization back from really pushing around the edges of different areas of transformation or disruption. And quite often those fractional leaders have done that before and are well read in or well experienced in some of that disruptive thinking. So
just thinking, my daughter recently just started as a part-time restaurateur. She's welcoming people to her restaurant. We wouldn't describe her as a fractional restaurateur. It's distinct. The role you're talking about is different from part-time. Why do you think this role is these kinds of roles are becoming more prevalent? In the intro, we looked at some of the data behind it. Why is it on the rise?
Well, I think there's a couple of factors, and one I do want to also call out that it contributes some to some of this is also the mass resignation factor.
Okay, what is that?
So the mass resignation trend, right? It started really kind of centrally during the pandemic. I know we talk a bit about how hybrid work and remote work, as an effect of the pandemic, has definitely caused a higher demand for this, right? Because we're more comfortable with not having, seeing these senior people all the time. They don't have to necessarily be walking the halls, have an office on some coveted floor in the headquarters kind of thing. But prior to even that, there was this beginning of this mass resignation trend, kind of coupled with the remote work, being comfortable with that. And that's where we've seen a lot of the top talent in many organizations decide to just walk away. Either that's retiring early, that might be going and pursuing other interests, that could be becoming a pilot or doing pottery or whatever that might be. But we've had a lot of high-end talent not either and there's been a lot of layoffs too, but some of these folks are walking out without being laid off. And so we're losing a lot of experience and seniority. It's causing great talent shortages across the board. And, when I think about the team that Synozur has been building for the last years, we've been a small organization that's been kind of taking advantage of some of these trends that you discussed in the intro in terms of mass layoffs by large organizations where you're seeing the top talent being, asked to go find other opportunities, but they're probably at a point in their careers where they were not that far away from traditional retirement. So they're not really looking to go in and be full-time yet again, prove themselves in a full-time capacity. So they're looking for fractional advisory or, relationships where they can go bring their expertise for some period of time, but not have to dig in for another 10 or 20 years. The folks that have left during mass resignation are looking for a very similar, often arrangement where their expertise can be leveraged, but they can also still pursue their other passions, right, that have probably little to do with the career building they've done for, potentially decades. There was this whole trend about 10 to 15 years ago, the whole liquid workforce studies where people were looking at, let's say, data architects when that was on the rise. And those folks were being able to pick and choose kind of that liquid, if you will, or fractional employment because they had some expertise that was hard to find. And with the rise of AI, I think that's going to spill into this becoming more and more prevalent in the workforce to get top talent. And we can now find talent anywhere in the world, that the whole working remote, talent that may have never been considered possible to capture in some of the remoter parts of the world who are incredibly worthy of being considered. It's now just, part of the talent pool that we as employers get to consider. And
Right.
I think if you're not taking advantage of this in all the different ways that we're talking about in today's session and some of our blog posts, you're really missing out on some potential competitive edge that otherwise you wouldn't find traditionally, maybe in your backyard.
Right. I also know that there's been a surge in startups, a lot of investment coming out of some of the funding that was common 3 or 4 years ago in the US, and a lot more coming into the market here in 2025. And you mentioned the great resignations before. I think the other thing that's going on there is there's been a flight of people who not only are trying to start new businesses, but are starting them in far-flung places, at least relative to where the large cities are. People moving to Bozeman, Montana to do their startup. And the prevalence and the acceptance of remote technology, I think, means that from a practitioner's perspective, you could be the CFO for a company in Montana on Monday, and then in Florida on Tuesday, and in Maine on Wednesday, and that's just fine.
It's a competitive advantage. One of the things I learned very quickly early in my consulting career, and then it just was kind of solidified even greater when I was working at the Big Five, is that cross-industry exposure to transformation, thoughts, ideas, disruptions really increases your creative, kind of out of the box, if you will, thinking in terms of like what's possible potentially in your own organization. Being able to have a senior or experienced person kind of working across industries in those leadership roles and bringing those different disruptive ideas from another industry into your organization and kind of pushing around the, how could we apply this to our space or customers, I think really brings energy into places where maybe, in many cases, full-time senior leaders historically have been worked their way up within the organization in which they're leading, which that's also important, right? To understand how the organization operates and what the customers are really like, and if potentially even been customer facing at some point. But we're also seeing this trend where organizations are looking to hire senior talent from completely different industries because they're looking for that disruptive shakeup of thinking, if you will.
Right. I know another one of the rationales and benefits that goes on here is with not just the company's perspective, but with the practitioner's perspective. If you as a practitioner or you as the company are considering joining in a full-time role, making that role fractional provides a way for each to learn more about the other to determine, is this the best long-term fit? And I think that is one of the advantages to these. What are a couple of others that you've heard?
Yeah, I think if we touch on a little bit of the really hot one right now, the CAIO role that many organizations either are trying to hire or place, obviously many looking to bring high-tech execs into maybe what's not a high-tech industry to get that role placed. I predict and suspect that what we will see is people will hire these high-powered, incredibly smart CAIOs. And in some cases, those could become long-term, full-time, forever organizational structures. If it's, a place where you really start to become AI-centric in terms of your processes, products, your services. I believe we have another podcast where we even used AI to kind of amplify a podcast, and then they started talking about a bakery where the business itself became very AI-centric. So in that place, I could see a long-term role for CAO, and I'm not saying all bakeries should have CAO.
You remember you remember I hosted that podcast. I am familiar when you did that.
Yeah. I thought that was fascinating to think about it in terms of a bakery, but if I think about it in terms of many organizations where that may not be the case, that CAIO role will likely get absorbed in 5 years or so organizationally and become part of operations or something else, right? It probably won't be long-termly established as its own, executive suite role. And so in that fractionality, it helps you kind of test set strategy and kind of see what direction is that disruption going to take the company, and does it make sense to organizationally like completely recreate the structures? And if it does, great, then maybe that person becomes fully dedicated, or maybe the edge is to keep them fractional so they can go do that in some other places. But it gives the organization time to really determine if that's one, if the organizationally, two, if the person that they brought in, because this is a very, very new designation of C-suite title. And just because you might be further ahead than everyone else right now in AI doesn't mean necessarily long-term that you are a CAIO in terms of experience, talent, strategic vision, execution, all the things that makes it very hard to be C-suite. I was watching a video recently, like if you're carrying a C title, it's not super glamorous. You're expected to go fix the hardest problems that the smartest people you hired in your organization can't fix without you. So when they bring you those really difficult problems, you spend a lot of your time in that C title fixing like the most difficult, hardest to solve challenges for the business. Fractionality kind of gives you the opportunity to test that out. I think one of the other roles most folks don't talk about, and I'm not sure why it's kind of running out of favor, but I think they're such high value in more complex organizations, is the chief of staff. I even heard someone the other day say chief of staff is out. It's so old, the title. We're now calling it something else. Chief of staff is incredibly high value, and I don't think it should be falling out of favor. So I think that's another opportunity from a fractionality perspective, where folks with those skills, those highly operational, attuned skills that really kind of make all the trains run on time and help orchestrate executives in complex organizations.
I've always thought that chief of staff, and it's a role probably that television watchers may remember best Leo on The West Wing, that if you're clever about it, just being able to control the flow of people and information in and around the chief executive can really set the course for what they see and what they move, and can have a real impact there. We're talking about some of the advantages. Let's talk a little bit more about results. What does success look like for the person or for the organization in these fractional CxO roles?
If you're a startup and you're looking to bring in a CxO fractional leader, let's say in terms of like CMO, right? Maybe you're a software company or a startup and you're trying to bring a AI product to market in a certain ecosystem. That role is about making sure, often strategic vision is properly set, and packaging and messaging, and do you really understand the problem you're solving? And is your product really a product, or is it just consulting ware, if you will? If you're a large organization and let's say you're bringing in, let's say a transformation officer, because you're taking on a lot of transformation that could be in people, process, and systems across the board. And for a period of time, you need to run kind of like an adjacent organization or a whole office, if you will, and you need a leader who's done that a lot before. That what good looks like for that looks very different than that fractional CMO we just discussed. And so I think it's really about understanding and defining. I think that might be what you're getting at, is like, what is success look like if I'm, going to go hire or look for that kind of talent? And often that talent, by the way, can help you define that. So don't feel like you have to do that by yourself. Many of these fractional senior leaders can absolutely collaborate with you and say, hey, you're thinking about bringing me in, but let's talk about why, and let's set what the success criteria looks like, right? And how long, or how do you measure that, and what is the impact you expect from bringing that kind of talent into your organization. Those folks should also be looking for kind of what's the cultural fit, I think is super important with your current organization. So
let's look at the other side of it. What are some of the risks for the individual or for the organization? These roles may not be appropriate for all circumstances.
I could think of a couple scenarios. We work with some founder-led organizations where, let's say, they have very highly sensitive formulations for some of the products they bring to market, right? And those formulations are really their competitive edge in terms of market. I don't think that if I were them, and I think that they're not comfortable with kind of letting someone that's fractionally or not fully committed to the organization in on the top secret formulas or the top secret ingredients with someone like that. I think that's one scenario potentially. We've already talked about another where maybe it's AI for a purpose in a period of time, but it's not AI forever kind of role, right?
I think that's very true. One thing I've observed in some other organizations is they may believe that they need a fractional role, but what they really do need is a full-time role, because sometimes to enact kind of not just strategy setting, but executed transformation is really hard to make happen in 4 hours a week. So that's another thing I've seen some organizations not embrace the role fully enough.
Yeah, I will add though, when we're talking fractional, it's not just, it absolutely could be 4 hours a week for a period of time. It could also be full-time for 6 months, right? And in that terms, it's still fractional because it's not a full-time employee headcount commitment, right? In the scenario of the transformation officer, yeah, you can't really do that 4 hours a week. We've learned that. But you're not in full heavy transformation mode. Most organizations on certain set of programs in perpetuity, right? There's a start and end to that.
Absolutely. If there's certain roles in industries where, let's say you're located in the middle of the country, 30 miles outside of Wichita, Kansas. If you need a new CFO or you need a new chief operations officer for a manufacturing floor, you might really need someone who can be on site full time, and finding someone who can do that may take a while, but plugging the gap with someone remotely, I've seen work in a few circumstances.
Or maybe you had somebody leave unexpectedly and you need someone to sit in that role for a while. And potentially what often happens for us is if we are fulfilling that gap, there's a point in time where we also then help hire, recruit, interview the replacement candidate. So, sometimes it's truly a gap in terms of, oh my gosh, somebody, or, unfortunately, maybe health issues, time for recovery, whatever that is, right? There's sometimes gaps that are unforeseen and aren't industry driven or market driven, where organizations need that support. So, and then need to transition back into a full-time hire.
Right. You're discussing some Synozur's approach. So let me give you a chance to talk about that. How is Synozur responding to the market needs for fractional CxOs?
And so one of the ways we're responding is a little bit of what I talked about in terms of the talent market, is acquiring talent on our side that can fulfill that. That's one way. We have a lot of folks that are quite suited for that, and that's been intentional recruiting on our part. Secondarily, it's being very flexible in terms of the models that we offer to customers that may have that need. in terms of, like I mentioned, we might fulfill something for a gap or something that's market trend driven for a period of time, or it could be product launch driven, to the point about the CMO conversation earlier. And then if it becomes a more full-time need, being, flexible in our approach to say, hey, we can help do interview panels. We can help you hire and find that talent as well through our network or through their recruiting system. So we are find ourselves to be incredibly pliable and nimble because of our size to be able to respond to those needs. And also because we spend a lot of time researching those trends, we can be fairly responsive in asking, I guess, maybe the right questions, right? If we're talking to a client and they're talking about launching a new AI product, we can kind of dig in with them and say, hey, do you have all your bases covered, right, to be successful? And we can work through that with them.
One of the potential risks, since a fractional executive is less tied to the organization than a traditional employee, you've talked about plugging gaps when a traditional employee leaves, but from an organization perspective, how can you make sure that your fractional staff stays connected and stays engaged?
Well, I think, you've got to, if you're going to have fractional leadership, you've got to treat them like part of the leadership. So you've got to, I think, fold them in or slipstream them into the appropriate leadership, collaboration, and work streams. I think you've got to give them clear goals and objectives, and some of this gets into like how strong is that culturally in your organization, and it's another topic for another day. And our company OS conversations kind of lead into that a little bit. And I think you've got to be open and transparent in communications with those leaders.
Michelle, you've studied this space for some time. What are some things about fractional executive roles that our audience may not know?
Even though the trend is on the rise, to really consider the value and the potential of having a fractional leader in your organization. I think a lot of companies will talk about it, but they're, I think, still a little hesitant to action that. I think a lot of customers, and rightly so, concerned about the cultural fit of someone that's not like fully, if you will, dedicated, papered to the organization's success. And what I found is those fractional leaders are far less complacent than people who may have, been sitting in roles for a very long time.
I always like to wrap up by asking our guests to share something from the human side of who they really are. If you think over the past month, is there a movie, book, song, article, even a podcast or something else that's really had an impact on you?
Well, it's a podcast that I listen to. I don't listen to a lot of podcasts, by the way, but I listen to snippets of this one quite often. And Simon Sinek's A Bit of Optimism is a fantastic podcast for our leaders. And if you're not listening to it, I highly recommend it.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you so much for spending time with me and with our audience today. What's the best way for them to follow you and stay in touch?
The best way to follow or stay in touch is probably LinkedIn. I do most of my musings and thinkings about things I'm reading that are, inspiring to me or I think others could benefit from out there. So LinkedIn is the best place to find
Terrific.
me.
Thanks a lot for coming back on the show. Really appreciate the insights that you brought to Fractional CxOs, and best of luck until the next time we speak.
Hey, thank you.
Gonna wrap. Up next on Polaris, events. As 2025 gets underway, there's lots to look forward to in the new year, and we have a busy schedule. Starting this week with SharePoint, from concept to creation to impact, with a live AMA webinar. That'll be hosted by Jeff Tieper from Microsoft, live online, January 29th at 9 a.m. Pacific Time, 12 Eastern in the U.S. Also this week, Trends Shaping Knowledge, sponsored by Clear People, one of our favorite employee experience vendors. Katya Lenosi, their CEO, will host Marian Hermkes, Barry Byrne from Novartis and the Knowledge Summit, and also me to look ahead at knowledge, AI use cases, technology trends, and more. That'll be happening January 30th at 8 a.m. Pacific Time, 11 a.m. Eastern, and you can register at clearpeople.com. Coming up next month, M365 Miami 2025. That'll be happening February 6th through 7th. Later this spring, the Microsoft 365 Community Conference. This will be held May 5th through 8th at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. Jeff Teeper and Jairus Pitaro will be keynoting for Microsoft, along with many other speakers from Microsoft, Synozur, partners, customers, and more, also including me. You can learn more and register at nextgen365events.com. And wrapping up the first half of the year, TechCon 365 Seattle, June 23rd to 27th. As we're heading into summer, Synozur will be sponsoring and also speaking at TechCon 365. It will be held at the Seattle Conference Center. You can learn more at techcon365.com. We'll have links to all of that and more in the show notes. You can learn more at synozur.com/events, and we'll add more events throughout the year. And if you have an upcoming event you'd like us to promote on Polaris, please get in touch and we'd be happy to include it. Well, that's going to wrap up another episode. I'd like to thank our guest, Michelle Caldwell, for joining us and sharing her insights on fractional CxOs. We encourage you to check out our show page for links to everything we talked about today and more. Visit us at polaris.synozur.com. Send us your questions and feedback for the Synozur team. You can reach us via email at polaris@synozur.com. Remember to rate, review, and tell all your friends about the show. Follow the show wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Thanks for listening. I'm Chris McNulty, and this has been Polaris, the show that charts the course for business and technology transformation from Synozur. Learn more at synozur.com. See you next time.